protect the interests of the American people. Thank you very much, sir.
You're going to do a great job.
These challenges aren't going away. So the argument in the book is for us to be introspective, but also to remain engaged in the world, to try to continue to understand these challenges and what we have to do to protect ourselves and our way of life, and to build a better future for generations to come.
Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Ellen Nakashima, a national security reporter with the Washington Post, and I'm pleased to have here with me today President Trump's former national security advisor, retired Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He's the author of a new book, Battlegrounds: The Fight to Defend the Free World. General McMaster, congratulations on your new book, and thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks, Ellen. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, General, you were National Security Advisor for 13 months, and in that role, you assessed the national security threats that our adversaries pose. Give me brief one description paragraphs of the Russian leaders Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Why are they a threat to us? And how are their goals different, and where do they converge?
Well, Ellen, as I came into the White House quite unexpectedly, I really had a sense that we were behind. We were behind in critical competitions, largely because we had vacated arenas of competition based on overconfidence in the end of the Cold War, and then really pessimism and resignation after a series of strategic shocks and disappointments in the 2000s. And so, in particular, I thought we were behind in the area of great power competition. We had assumed, right, at the end of the Cold War, a great power competition was over. It was a relic of the past. And what Russia had done since Vladimir Putin really took over in the year 2000, but especially, I think, after 2007 with denial of service attacks on Estonia, with really then a sustained campaign of political subversion against the West, is that Putin waged a campaign designed to drag us down. Putin is driven, I believe, by the emotion of disappointment, a sense of honor lost as the Soviet Union broke up, and then a related determination to restore Russia to national greatness. But he doesn't have a lot of good raw material to work with. So instead of trying to compete with us on Russia's own terms, I mean, the economy is about the size of Texas's economy. He has some significant problems, especially now, you could argue, with COVID and the collapse of oil prices. So really, Putin's design is to be the last man standing. What he wants to do is he wants to polarize our societies in the West and within our democracies, pit us against each other, reduce our confidence in who we are and in our democratic institutions and principles and processes. With China, I think China is driven by different set of emotions and aspirations. China sees itself as emerging from what Chinese Communist Party leaders have called the century of humiliation. And now it is the opportunity for China to take center stage in the world, in the language of Xi Jinping, and to realize its goals under the program of national rejuvenation. But this external goal is part of its effort to ensure that it remains in power. And so the Chinese Communist Party is driven by certainly aspiration, but really fear of losing control. And that's why you see the party internally extending and tightening its grip on power by the creation of this technologically enabled Orwellian surveillance police state. And this is why I think as well now, in the wake of the COVID-19, not in the wake of it, but in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, see an increasingly aggressive Chinese Communist Party externally as well, as it's trying to now export its authoritarian and mercantilist model. If China succeeds, the world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. And we've already seen the damage that Russia can do to our own confidence and our own psyche.
So, General, 3.5 years, almost 4 years now into a Trump administration, how do our strategic competitors view the United States?
Well, I think that they view us as weak at the moment, right? Because they see us in the midst of now today, especially a triple crisis, a crisis of the pandemic, the recession associated with the pandemic, and the social divisions laid bare by the murder of George Floyd, social tensions associated with issues of race and inequality of opportunity, and then Alan, this vitriolic partisan discourse where we're at each other's throats. So I think if Xi Jinping in particular, you're a dictator, you probably surround yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear. And I think what he's hearing is, hey, you're on top, you're winning. Look how weak they are. We're emerging first out of this pandemic economically. Now's the time to act. And you see that with this very aggressive action on the part of the Chinese Communist Party, whether it's wolf warrior diplomacy aimed at Europe and the United States, principally massive cyber attacks across all sectors in Australia, attacking our research facilities, medical research facilities, and pharmaceutical companies with cyber attacks, the repression of freedom in Hong Kong, the continuation of cultural genocide in Xinjiang, bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier, more and more
Right.
aggression in the South China Sea, which, if they succeed, will be the largest land grab, so to speak, in history. And then the increasingly threatening language, but also actions aimed at Taiwan. So I think we can answer your question by look at what China's doing. These are the actions, I think, of Chinese Communist Party leadership that feels very confident, but also feels like this fleeting window of opportunity to realize its goals might be closing a bit faster due to COVID-19 and the recession associated with.
You talk in your book about the the tools that Russia uses, that Putin uses. You call it Putin's playbook, right? This whole idea of using disinformation to divide and weaken us. And you just described it so vividly now. You also noted that the president seems to, at times, to abet Russian disinformation and denial. What do you mean by that? How do the president's
Well, he
actions
does,
aid
right?
Russia?
So what Putin banks on, right, is his ability to disrupt us, to attack us, and then just deny it. And this is what my old British counterpart Mark Sedgwick used to call implausible deniability. And so when President Putin really engages in these acts, what typically follows is brazen denial, but then also what you might call a fire hose of falsehood, right? And a
And
series of propaganda and conspiracy theories. Well, I mean, the president plays into that whenever he doesn't just directly confront Putin publicly, attribute these attacks to him and to the Kremlin. It gives him wiggle room. I mean, you have to. I mean, this is a Kremlin who they shot down an airliner, right? And there's all sorts of incontrovertible evidence, on social media and elsewhere about it, and they just flat deny it, right? Or the Skripal poisoning, or now the Navalny poisoning.
right.
Putin had the temerity to suggest that Navalny maybe somehow poisoned himself, right? So
And
I
the
think,
president hasn't spoken out about that, has he?
no, I think he should have. I think he should have. I mean, there's really no other plausible explanation. Maybe they're waiting for more intelligence, and that maybe that's the case. As you recall, in April 2018, I was still on the job. I was in my last week or so in the job during the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury, England, that placed, I mean, about over 1,000 people at risk of this nerve agent. And the president and the administration took some very strong action on that occasion.
But only
Closing
after
the
you had to really twist his arm to do so, right?
Well, I think what we were able to do is describe, how this is in U.S. interests. It's in all of our interests to support. In this case, you could argue our closest ally, the UK. But this was an egregious act, right? So we're just now over 100-year anniversary of the end of World War One. And we can't allow the use of these heinous weapons, chemical weapons, to become normalized by Vladimir Putin. Not only is he using it in these assassination attempts, but he's providing cover for the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons to commit mass murder of innocent people in Syria.
Why did the president hold Putin in such high regard, have such a hard time calling him out?
I don't know. I don't know. I think, I think in the book, in Battlegrounds, I write about how now this is the third administration that has had this sort of illusion and desire to have a better relationship with Vladimir Putin, right? We
Mm,
remember George W. Bush looked into Putin's soul. You had President Obama lean over to Medvedev, who was keeping the seat warm for Putin,
sure.
saying, "Hey, we'll have more flexibility after the election." And Secretary Hillary Clinton brought the reset button to Lavrov in Geneva. Well, ultimately, I mean, those two administrations were profoundly disappointed because of again the ideology, the emotions, the aspirations that drive Vladimir Putin, who sits
Right.
atop, by the way, a criminalized protection network in Russia that he doesn't want to lose control of as well. And so I think President Trump is setting himself up, for the same kind of disappointment. And I think that we have to show maybe I think we have to be more adept at learning from our most recent past, which
Mm,
apparently we have a hard time doing.
mm. I have to bring up, the latest news because it just is so relevant to what we're talking about. You certainly, as
I was
national
hoping
security.
I was hoping you would, Ellen.
Well, here you go. We now know, right, that President Trump has some significant personal debt, hundreds of millions of dollars in loans that will come due in the next few years. Is that the sort of thing that poses a counterintelligence risk? As national security advisor, you certainly knew that having significant personal debt makes one susceptible to compromise. What do you think?
Well, Ellen, I'm just reading the same reports you are, so I
Mhm.
can't talk about this. I don't know any more than what I'm reading
But
in the
in general
Washington
terms,
Post and other
yeah,
publications. But in general terms, right, the Russians, what they try to do is try to get compromise on on everybody, right, and to use it against leaders across the political spectrum, because really what I think we're seeing is a new evolution, and I write about this in Battlegrounds, of Russian new generation warfare. And of course, in the past, it's always been propaganda, disinformation, going back to the 1920s and the KGB, right, to divide us on issues of race or any other hot button
absolutely.
political issues. And but now they have new tools to do it. And now what we're seeing is they're trying to make our government ineffective by weaponizing social media even further and going after individuals within the government. And so, I mean, I experienced this
Including yourself,
personally. I read about
right.
that the Fire
But
McMaster
but
campaign.
just to foot stomp your
So
right, just to table thump the point you made earlier, when the president himself, when the you have an administration that was trying to, deter Putin, trying to, carry out a strategy to counter his malign, interference efforts and influence. But when the president himself does not amplify those efforts, speaking from the bully pulpit to call out Putin and say, "This shall not stand," does he undermine those efforts?
absolutely, yes, yes, and we have to not be our own worst enemy, right? I mean, I
Okay.
mean, I think Putin celebrates every time that we introduce ourselves a degree of ambiguity about the sustained campaign of political subversion that he's waging, really not just against the United States. He kind of perfected a lot of these techniques in Europe, and he's trying to break apart Europe, and he's trying to rend the transatlantic relationship, and he's trying to break apart NATO, right? And this is again this idea that from this position of weakness, his plan is to be the last man standing.
Right. Well, so let's move to China for a minute. This is area where the administration has managed to move the needle in highlighting trade secret theft, coercive state behavior. You've indicted hackers, you've pressed allies to ban Huawei, and yet you see a president who is singularly focused on showing benefits from his phase one trade deal, while taking half measures against China for its crackdown on Hong Kong, its repression of Muslim minorities. Are these measures the administration is taking more of an optic of toughness with the Chinese rather than an actual policy of fundamentally rebalancing the relationship with China to address systemic issues and protect American security?
Yeah. Ellen, I see a fundamental shift in policy. It really is. I think it's the most significant shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And as you mentioned, there are imperfections in the implementation of any strategy or policy. But if you think about it, right, our policy had been this policy of cooperation and engagement with China based on what we know now. It was a fundamentally flawed assumption, a group of assumptions, a pipe dream, really, that the Chinese Communist Party, having been welcomed into the international order, would play by the rules, would liberalize its economy, and as it prospered, it would liberalize its form of governance as well. Well, it's actually doing the opposite of that. And so our assumption has to be that the Chinese Communist Party will not play by the rules. The Chinese Communist Party will continue its various forms of aggression, including economic aggression against us and other free market economic systems, and be increasingly aggressive in exporting its model. So what you see is a strategy of competition and a broad range of actions that are being undertaken diplomatically, militarily, from a law enforcement perspective, and from an economic perspective. And when you list all of these initiatives and actions, they really do amount to a strategy. And I think if you want to really understand it better, it's in the National Security Strategy from December 2017. But Vice President Pence's speech that he gave in New Guinea, about a year and a half ago, and then it's very Chinese of us, but the four speeches that were given by administration officials recently. I think this is a shift that has bipartisan support too, Ellen, which I think is immensely important.
No doubt about it. But there is a tension between the economic and trade issues and the national security. You see it played out, with TikTok.
No, there is. There certainly is. And then there are mistakes made, right? I mean, how are steel and aluminum tariffs on our allies? Like, how does that help us with China? Right? So I think that the next step in this has got to be multinational cooperation on this taken to the next level. There's a lot of multinational cooperation going on in this, much more than meets the eye. But I think whenever the U.S., Japan, and the EU, and now the UK, and now maybe India as well, if we confront Chinese economic aggression, for example, together, it's really going to be tough, for the Chinese Communist Party to do what it's done in the past. What I describe in the book is this campaign of co-option, coercion, and concealment.
Nice alliteration there. So let's apply this to Taiwan. Right now, Beijing is placing some tremendous economic pressure on Taiwan, and when it's doing so, strengthening the U.S.-Taiwan economic relationship is one of the most important things that the U.S. can do to help Taiwan defend itself. Yet the administration has been dragging its feet on initiating trade talks with Taiwan, despite the huge political risks that its president, Tsai Ing-wen, has taken to open the door. So, look, is preserving the the phase one trade deal more important than initiating trade talks with Taiwan here, given that China is not even living up to its side of the deal?
I don't think so. I think we should pursue the bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. Obviously, they're already a big trading partner. There have been some recent decisions, for example, like the movement of TSMC's chip manufacturing to Arizona, that'll be tremendously beneficial, I think, to our security and also American prosperity. So I think those initial talks are ongoing. I don't know. I don't have the insider information, but as you know, these trade agreements, they take some time, right? That's the downside of these series of bilateral trade agreements, is that they're time consuming. I think that's going to be the future, though. I don't see either party really reinvigorating multilateral trade agreements like TPP. I know everybody's nostalgic for it, but we tend to forget that a Hillary Clinton administration would have pulled out a TPP as well, based on the growing sentiment and an understandable sentiment in the United States that large sectors of the American economy and American society have been left behind by the globalized economy. So I think we ought to move out on it, and I think we ought to move out on it with other countries as well, across the Indo-Pacific region, to solidify our economic relationships, because already the countries in the region, they're really eager to deepen our security cooperation because of the threat from China and the way that China is using coercive military power along with coercive economic power to create servile relationships with countries across the Indo-Pacific.
So let's move to North Korea in the few minutes we have left. You tried to enforce a maximum pressure strategy to curb Kim Jong-un's weapons development, nuclear weapons development. But North Korea has continued its program. It's launched 3 ICBMs since 2017. Bob Woodward, in his latest book, Rage, says that the American people had no idea how close we were to war with North Korea in the second half of 2017. Is that true? And if
I
so,
don't
what
think
brought
so.
us so close?
I think it's exaggerated. I think that's exaggerated. I think that what we did, and I think what is
Secretary
still
Mattis slept
immense.
in his gym shorts. Remember?
Yeah, I don't get that. I just don't understand. I mean, I don't understand it.
Okay.
I mean,
In-
if it's true, I mean, I don't know if should you believe everything that's in that book. I don't know. I don't know. It's up to readers to decide. I don't ask Secretary Mattis, who's a who was a great colleague in the administration and now at the Hoover Institution. But that's one of the first things I'll ask him if we ever run into each other at the coffee machine again in the post-COVID period. but I think that's exaggerated, you know. I think that what the administration did at this period of time, which was important, is to recognize you can't just do diplomacy and then prepare for military contingencies separate from that. You have to integrate what you're doing militarily to convince Kim Jong Un that he's safer without the weapons than he is with them. That doesn't mean you're on a march toward war, but what you're doing is that you are using your military capabilities as an incentive, along with the unprecedented sanctions, to test this thesis that we could convince Kim Jong Un that he's safer without the weapons. I think there's a tendency, these days to think of instruments of power as being used separately or sequential, when in fact, in fact they have to be integrated. And it would have been irresponsible. It still would be irresponsible if we weren't preparing for the worst scenario in which Kim Jong Un is maybe thinking about an attack against Japan, South Korea, the United States. I mean, how do we know? When these erector launchers roll out of a mountain, that it has a test missile or a real missile, or a test warhead or a real warhead. And so it's a dangerous situation, that's for sure. But I'm reminded of Secretary George Shultz had a great saying. He said that negotiation is a euphemism for capitulation unless the shadow of power is cast across the negotiating table. And so the strategy of maximum pressure was meant to integrate elements of power, and also to communicate to China clearly as well, right? Every provocation is driving our allies and partners closer together with one another. And so I think that the strategy is still intact. I think it has the best chance for success. What we were determined to do is not repeat the failed pattern of previous efforts.
Moving to South Asia, you say you became convinced that U.S. strategy in Afghanistan was the opposite of what was needed, which was a long-term commitment, not a withdrawal timetable. But now the Taliban and Afghan government are engaged in talks that will result in just that, the withdrawal of U.S. and NATO troops. So what do you think of the wisdom of the current peace process in Doha?
It's unwise. I think it's a pipe dream. I think it's doomed to failure. I mean, I think that what's paradoxical about this, is that the Trump administration has replicated almost precisely the flaws in the Obama administration approach to Afghanistan, and in particular, it has created, and I use this term, strategic narcissism in battlegrounds to describe our tendency to define problems and challenges as we would like them to be, rather than they really are. And in this case, to conjure up, an enemy in Afghanistan that we would prefer rather to the actual enemy in Afghanistan, which is a Taliban that is utterly intertwined with other terrorist organizations, including Al Qaeda. So this idea that there's a bold line between them, it's an absolute pipe dream, as is this the neglect to recognize that the regenerative capacity of the Taliban lies across the border in Pakistan, as it has since we drove them out of Kabul in 2001. And so I think that it is ill-conceived. I think that really what we've done in the negotiations, Ellen, is we've set up the Afghan government for more difficulty. I mean, if it was our objective to leave, just leave, right? But don't cut a deal first with the Taliban that then puts the Afghan government in an immensely difficult position. Don't coerce them to release 5,000 of the most heinous people on earth, who are now going to be free to establish a terrorist infrastructure, much like the release of Al-Qaeda and Iraq prisoners did to establish ISIS in Syria and in Iraq after December 2011. So again, this is I think a classic case of strategic narcissism, wishful thinking, and ultimately self-delusion. And you see that with the continuation of these Taliban attacks. Ellen, I argue in the book that this has not been a 20-year war, 19-year war. It's been a 1-year war 20 times over, and we have not had a sustained strategy. And what I'm not calling for hundreds of thousands of American troops again, or tens of thousands even of American troops. It's worth supporting Afghan security forces that are bearing the brunt of this fight on the frontier, I think a modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization. We lost 10 heroes, American heroes in combat in Afghanistan this year. But the Afghan soldiers and police, there are 30 of them making the ultimate sacrifice every day in Afghanistan to ensure that they can retain the freedoms that they won after the fall of the Taliban in 2001.
From the few minutes we have left, I'd like to squeeze in two more questions. One about the election and the role of the military. So there have been reports that Pentagon officials are increasingly concerned about the role of the military in the coming election, especially if it's disputed and there is civil unrest. This past weekend, you said the military will have no role in the transition and that even talking about it is dangerous. But what happens if the sitting commander-in-chief invokes the Insurrection Act in the wake of the election? How can military leaders defy the chain of command?
Well, I mean, this is why our founders set up separation of powers, right? We have to have confidence in it, and I think you can't go wrong, by going back to the Federalist Papers and Federalist 10 in particular, that talked about factions and how dangerous factions were and how factions can lead to violence. That's what really led. That was these documents were obviously the groundwork to the Constitution, and that's what led to the articles of the Constitution that separate powers. And what's going to decide the election, first of all, who is going to, are the American people, because in our revolution we signed up for the radical idea that sovereignty lies with the people. And then, of course, if those votes need to be adjudicated or verified, we have a court system for that. And we have checks on executive power that rest primarily within the Congress. And so I think that I think we are in good shape if we sustain our confidence in our democratic processes. I've been concerned, obviously, with the president's statements, which I think are completely inappropriate. But sometimes, Ellen, the reaction on the left or the opposition is just as bad. You had, I think, at one point, Vice President Biden saying that the Joint Chiefs of Staff are going to march, the president out of the way. That's crazy talk, right?
Right.
And our founders were very much affected by the English Civil War and the specter of Oliver Cromwell. And they drew this bold line, between our military and politics. This is why I never even voted. I took George Marshall's example to be studiously apolitical across my 34-year military career. We have to guard it. And your responsibility is within the military profession not to become politicized, but responsibility also rests with our politicians. I mean, they cannot be party, the president or anybody else, to trying to drag the military into partisan politics.
You said you entered West Point at 17 and you've never voted since you became eligible. Will you vote for the first time this year?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me clarify this. I did this because I took my example from George Marshall. I never begrudged anyone else in the military voting. I encourage others to vote. Everybody should vote. It's a personal choice I made to be studiously apolitical. I am going to vote in this election. I'm now in my second career here. As a retired officer, but I'll never endorse a candidate or get involved in partisan politics, because I think even retired officers can unwittingly be a party to this politicization of the military. There's this weird practice now, which I don't get. I mean, I don't begrudge anybody doing it. Of course, it's their decision to do it. But these dueling lists of like how many admirals and generals one party has versus how many admirals and generals another, I just don't see that that's helpful at all.
Are you registered to any party?
Independent.
Okay, thank you. So my final question, I'd like to end with this, is in your 1997 book, Dereliction of Duty, You pass judgment on senior military leaders for failing in their duty to push back harder against President Johnson's Vietnam strategy that they knew was doomed to fail. Now, more than 2 decades later, you've written a book drawing from your own experiences as National Security Advisor. Do you think you lived up to the high standard you set in your earlier book and spoke truth to power?
Yeah, I
And what's
did,
your response?
Ellen, and I was determined to do it. You know, when I interviewed for the job, it was a bonus round for me. I was going to retire from the Army, and I decided when I took the job as National Security Advisor, no matter what I was offered in terms of competing for four-star positions, that I would retire out of that job and just do that job as long as I could for as best as I could, and until I was used up in the job, which kind of ultimately happened. But I was at peace with that. I write in Battlegrounds about the lessons I drew from the Vietnam period. And it was really kind of surreal to walk into George Bundy's office in the West Wing and realize that I'm now responsible for the process that I criticized from a historical perspective. So, what I couldn't understand about my research on the decisions that led up to Vietnam is that some of the president's advisors, they concluded, hey, to maintain my influence with Lyndon Johnson, I'm not going to tell him what I really think about Vietnam. Of course, that begs the question, what the heck good is your influence anyway, right? So I thought it would be a disservice to the president if I didn't give him the benefit of analysis from across the departments and agencies, right? Because I'm not omniscient as a national security advisor. My job is to give him, in whatever venue is appropriate, the best advice from across the government. And I believe I did that. I believe in those 13 months I was there, we got some pretty darn good policy outcomes as a result. But I had a shelf life as a result, and I was at peace with that. I wasn't there for me. I wasn't there for any agenda except to serve the president and to serve the Constitution, strengthen our nation. And it was a privilege to do it, right? It was a privilege to do it. And what I regret these days is that we are so much at each other's throats, And what I hope this book will do is help people have civil, meaningful discussions. And then I just wish that in all these crucial challenges to our security, our prosperity, our future that I lay out, let's just begin conversations with what we can agree on and then get to points of disagreement. I think we just go immediately to the personalization of our politics, and then also what we disagree on.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have now, General McMaster, but thank you so much for joining me for having this discussion.
Hey, Ellen, as always, I enjoyed our conversation so much. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in. This afternoon at 3, join my colleague David Ignatius for a conversation with the creators of Kingdom of Silence, a new documentary that examines the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States in light of the murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi 2 years ago. You can find out more at WashingtonPostLive.com. And once again, I'm Ellen Nakashima, and thanks for watching Washington Post Live.